It was a calm evening in a small-town diner, the kind of place where time always seemed to slow down. The lights above were warm and soft, spreading a golden glow over every table and booth. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mixed with the scent of pie and butter sizzling on the grill. Old jazz played softly from the corner speaker, steady and smooth, and a few regulars sat in their usual spots, quietly eating their meals. The clink of forks against plates and the soft chatter of tired voices made everything feel peaceful, like nothing bad could happen in a place like this. But that peace was about to break in a way no one expected. William sat by the window, like he did every Friday night. He was an elderly black veteran, a man with silver hair, strong shoulders, and eyes that had seen too much of the world to be shaken easily. He wore his old military jacket, not to boast, but because it reminded him of the men he had served with, of the years he had survived. The jacket had patches that spoke louder than any words could, a quiet reminder that this man had earned respect. Every Friday he came, ordered the same meal, left a tip bigger than anyone expected, and nodded politely to everyone who passed. He was quiet, steady, and kind. People in the diner knew him, and they liked him. But this night wasn't like all the other nights. The bell above the door jingled sharply, cutting through the soft music like a knife. 3 people walked in. They didn't come quietly. They came like they owned the world. At the front was the HOA president, a tall man with a sharp jaw and a heavy ego. His loud laugh filled the diner as if he was trying to drown out everyone else. Behind him followed 2 board members, men who always stuck close to him, laughing at his jokes and nodding at everything he said like puppets. Their fancy jackets, loud voices, and smug grins didn't fit with the quiet warmth of the diner. They walked in with the kind of energy that turned heads, not because anyone liked them, but because they demanded attention. The moment the president's eyes landed on William, his smirk changed. It wasn't just arrogance now, it was something uglier. He leaned closer to the man beside him and said something in a low voice, but it wasn't quiet enough. William heard it. The waitress heard it. And a few of the regulars sitting near the counter heard it too. The board members chuckled like they were part of some cruel little joke. The president looked at William the way a bully looks at someone he's decided to pick on. William kept his eyes on his coffee cup. He didn't react. He didn't look their way. He had learned long ago that not every fight was worth standing up for, but he also knew when a storm was coming. His hands stayed steady as he lifted his cup to his lips. He had seen men like this before. Loud, arrogant, drunk on the idea that the world belonged to them. They didn't scare him. They just disgusted him. The HOA president picked the table directly across from William's booth, dragging the chair out loudly just to make sure everyone looked at him. He didn't care about food. He cared about control. "Well," he said loudly, grinning like he was the star of a show, "look who's here again. Same corner. Same table. Every damn Friday." His voice was rough, his words sharp enough to make people turn their heads. The waitress, Maria, froze for a second behind the counter. She had seen him before. She knew he liked to push buttons. She forced a polite smile and walked over to their table. "Good evening," she said softly, hoping to keep things calm. "Can I get you anything to drink?" He waved her off with a flick of his hand. "We'll order later," he said, not even looking at her. His attention stayed locked on William. "I'm just surprised this old man's still allowed to sit here like he owns the place." His voice wasn't just loud. It carried the kind of mockery that turned warmth into ice. The board members laughed on cue. Their laughter echoed in the quiet diner, making the regular customers shift uncomfortably in their seats. William slowly set his cup down, not slamming it, not rushing. Calm. Controlled. He turned his head just slightly, his eyes meeting the president's for the first time. His look wasn't angry. It wasn't scared. It was the quiet, steady look of a man who had seen far worse things than this. The president leaned back in his chair, clearly pleased with himself. "What's wrong, old man?" he said, pretending to stretch. "Cat got your tongue?" William didn't take the bait. He simply said in a calm, even voice, "I'm just trying to enjoy my dinner." That simple sentence made the man's fake smile flicker. Bullies wanted fire. They wanted anger. William's calmness was like a wall they couldn't break through. That made the president push harder. "Well," he said, pretending to look around the diner, "maybe some of us don't like you enjoying it here. Maybe you're not in the right place." Maria stiffened. One of the regulars, an older man sitting at the counter, lowered his fork and stared at the scene. The board members smirked like little shadows behind their leader, but their eyes gave them away. They weren't brave without him. The president, however, leaned forward, his elbows on the table, enjoying the silence. William's voice stayed low. "This is a diner," he said. "I can sit wherever I want." The president laughed, a fake, loud laugh that didn't match the quiet room. "Oh, really? You think just because you sit here every week, this place belongs to you?" The laughter died almost as quickly as it started. Even the music seemed softer now. The whole diner felt smaller, like everything was folding in on this moment. The air was thick, heavy. The waitress took a step forward, but William's calm look told her to stay back. He didn't want a scene. He never did. But what the HOA president didn't know, what none of them knew, was that William wasn't as alone as they thought. His quiet dignity wasn't weakness. It was strength. And that strength didn't just come from his past. It came from the bloodline that walked outside these doors. The bell above the diner door jingled again, this time softer. Headlights flashed briefly through the windows. A black SUV rolled slowly into the parking lot. No one inside noticed except Maria, who glanced toward the glass. But soon, everyone would. William didn't flinch. He didn't look back. He simply sat there, steady as a mountain, while the HOA president smirked, believing he was winning some kind of power game. He had no idea the game he started would be the one to break him. The night outside was still, but the storm was already walking toward the door. The air inside the diner grew heavier the moment the HOA president opened his mouth again, his voice cutting through the soft jazz like a rusted blade scraping glass. William stayed still, but the man wasn't done. Bullies never were. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and spoke louder now, making sure every person in the diner heard every word. "You know what the problem is with people like you," he said, his smirk widening. "You sit here like this place belongs to you. But it doesn't. It belongs to people like us." His finger jabbed in the air, as if pointing at something he owned. But he wasn't pointing at anything. He was pointing at William. The two board members laughed again, forced and fake, like trained dogs waiting for approval. They didn't have the courage to lead. They only had the courage to follow. Their eyes darted between William and the president, waiting for more to laugh at. The sound of their laughter bounced off the walls, making the space feel smaller. The other customers stared down at their plates, pretending not to hear, but their hands tightened on their utensils. Nobody liked what was happening, but nobody wanted to be the one to step into it. The president liked that. He fed on silence. Silence meant control. Maria, the waitress, took a step closer, holding the coffee pot tight. "Sir," she said carefully, "maybe it's best to let everyone enjoy their meal. It's Friday night." He snapped his head toward her with a glare that shut her down instantly. "Nobody asked you, sweetheart," he hissed. "We're just having a conversation with our old friend here." His eyes shifted back to William, and the grin returned. "Right, old man." William didn't answer. He didn't need to. He had dealt with men like this too many times in his life. Loud, empty, built on ego and nothing else. The kind of men who thought their position made them untouchable. He lifted his coffee cup slowly, not rushing, not reacting to their little show, and took a quiet sip. His calmness burned the president more than any words could. The man slammed his palm on the table suddenly, making cups rattle and forks clink against plates. The sound sliced through the soft music and chatter like thunder. "Hey!" he barked. "I'm talking to you." This time, William lifted his eyes. The look he gave wasn't angry, wasn't frightened. It was the look of a man who'd faced real danger in real places and knew what kind of person stood in front of him now. A bully who had never faced anything harder than his own reflection. That steady, Quiet gaze made the president's smirk falter for the first time. Just for a second. But he couldn't back down now. His pride wouldn't let him. So he leaned even closer, his voice turning low, like he wanted it to sound dangerous. "Do you even belong here?" he said. "Look at you. Sitting here like you matter. Like people care. This isn't your place, old man. You're just a shadow taking up space." The diner fell silent. No forks moved now. No one pretended not to hear. Even the jazz seemed quieter, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Maria's hands were shaking as she gripped the coffee pot. The old man at the counter clenched his fists but didn't get up. A young couple near the back lowered their heads. Everyone felt it, but nobody spoke. That was what bullies counted on. Fear. Silence. William didn't raise his voice. He simply said, calm and slow, "I've earned every right to be here. I served this country while people like you were still learning to tie their shoes." The words landed like a hammer, quiet but heavy. A few of the regulars lifted their heads. Maria blinked fast, holding back a reaction. The president laughed again, but this time it didn't sound the same. It cracked a little around the edges. "Oh please," he scoffed. "A war story? Spare me. You think wearing that old jacket makes you important? You're nothing special." One of the board members shifted nervously. The president didn't notice. He was too wrapped up in his own performance. He stood up now, stepping closer to William's table. Towering over him like that would make him more powerful. But William didn't flinch. He just kept looking up at him with those calm, unshaken eyes. The man's voice lowered again, but it was still loud enough for everyone to hear. "Men like you think you've done something big. But this is our town now. Our rules. You sit where we let you sit." William finally set his cup down, slow and deliberate. His hands didn't shake. "I don't need your permission," he said softly. That was the moment the president's temper broke. His face twitched, his eyes narrowed, and the fake grin twisted into something darker. He hated that William wasn't reacting the way he wanted. He hated that he wasn't afraid. The board members shifted in their seats, not sure whether to laugh or to get up. Everyone in the diner felt the pressure, the sense that something was about to snap. Maria stepped forward again, voice trembling but firm. "That's enough," she said. "You need to stop. Now." He turned on her again, barking, "Mind your business." The shout made the young couple in the back jump. Even the jazz cut out for a second. Then he looked back at William and said, almost growling, "Stand up." William didn't move. "I said stand up," the man repeated, louder now, trying to force him to react. But William just stared at him, his voice quiet and steady. "You don't command me." That sentence was small, but it hit the president harder than any punch could have. His hand curled into a fist. His jaw clenched. The board members watched nervously. He didn't care anymore about the whispers around him or the people watching. His pride was on the line. And that was when it happened. He stepped forward, his hand rising fast, and in one sharp motion, he struck William across the face. The sound echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Forks hit plates. Someone gasped. Maria dropped the coffee pot, the hot liquid spilling across the floor. The young couple at the back froze, eyes wide. The board members sat in stunned silence. No one moved. William didn't fall. He didn't even lean back. He just turned his head slowly, the red mark burning against his dark skin, and stared at the man standing in front of him. The president's grin returned, but it was forced now. His eyes darted around the diner, expecting applause, expecting approval. But what he saw was different. People weren't impressed. They were afraid. They were disgusted. And then, outside, tires crunched softly in the parking lot. Headlights flashed briefly against the glass. A black SUV pulled in. The man who stepped out of that car was tall, calm, and silent. He wasn't just anybody. He was William's son, and he was about to show the president just how big a mistake had been made. The slap still hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot, thick and heavy. The sound had echoed through the diner, and even though only a few seconds had passed, It felt like the whole room was frozen in that moment. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound left was the soft, uneven clinking of a spoon that had rolled off a table and spun slowly to a stop on the floor. William didn't fall, didn't stumble, didn't give the man what he wanted. He just turned his head back toward the HOA president with calm, steady eyes. It was the kind of look that didn't need words, the kind that made the bully's forced grin falter for the briefest moment. Maria stood near the counter, her hands shaking as she stared at the red mark on William's face. Her spilled coffee was spreading slowly across the floor, forgotten. The older man at the counter clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles went white. The young couple near the back held their breaths, their eyes wide, their bodies stiff with shock. Nobody moved because everyone felt it. Something had changed. The bully had crossed a line he couldn't step back over. The HOA president straightened his shoulders, puffing himself up like a rooster in an empty yard. He thought the silence meant power. He thought this was his victory. "That's what I thought," he said loudly, pretending to sound calm, but his voice had a slight tremor now. "That's what happens when you forget your place, old man." His words were meant to sting, to make William feel small, but they landed weak. The board members sitting behind him forced out uneasy laughs. Not because it was funny, but because they were too scared to do anything else. They weren't brave men. They were shadows standing behind a louder shadow. One of them looked at the door, like he was already thinking about leaving. William slowly raised his hand and wiped the corner of his mouth, where the slap had landed. Then he placed his hands flat on the table and pushed himself up, not with anger, not with speed, but with quiet strength. When he stood, the room seemed smaller. Even with his age, there was a weight to his presence, a history that made the loud man in front of him look small in comparison. The president took half a step back without meaning to. William's voice was quiet, low, and steady. "I've been hit harder by people who didn't live long enough to brag about it," he said. A hush spread through the room. It wasn't the kind of line people shouted. It wasn't meant to be loud. It was meant to be remembered. The president blinked, caught off guard, his smirk twitching. He forced a laugh, trying to get control back. "Oh, you think you're some kind of tough guy, huh?" he spat. "You're just an old man in a diner." But even as he said it, he could feel the power in the room slipping away from him. Bullies can smell fear, but they can also feel when the crowd turns cold. And right now, the crowd wasn't on his side anymore. Maria's eyes were locked on him with disgust. The old man at the counter wasn't afraid anymore. Even the couple in the back weren't looking down at their food. Everyone was looking at him, judging. The president turned his back to William, trying to brush it off, but something made him stop. A low rumble from outside, tires crunching slowly over gravel. Headlights flashed briefly against the diner window. The sound was subtle, but it made the board members glance nervously toward the door. Maria noticed too. Her breath hitched. "Someone's here," she whispered under her breath, though no one had asked. The door opened slowly. The bell jingled, but this time it didn't sound warm. It sounded like the beginning of something. A man stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit. His steps were silent, but every eye in the diner turned to him. His presence was calm, but there was weight behind it. The HOA president turned to look, frowning, not recognizing him. But William's eyes softened for the first time that night. "Dad," the man said quietly. The president laughed nervously. "Oh, look," he said, his voice rising like he was still in control. "The old man's got company." But the laughter didn't sound the same anymore. The man in the suit walked forward slowly, each step making the president's fake confidence fade just a little more. Maria stepped back, her heart pounding. She didn't know who he was yet, but something about him felt different, dangerously calm. He didn't shout, didn't rush. He just looked at his father's red cheek and then at the man who caused it. The president crossed his arms, trying to sound tough. "What? You here to cry for him?" he sneered. The man didn't answer. He just kept walking until there was nothing but 2 feet between them. Then, slowly, deliberately, He reached inside his jacket and pulled out his identification wallet. A golden Homeland Security badge caught the light, shining bright in the warm diner glow. The board members froze like statues. Maria's mouth fell open slightly. Even the old man at the counter sat up straighter. The president's smirk evaporated. The man's voice was calm, controlled, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "Who put their hands on my father?" The president tried to laugh again, but his throat was dry now. You think flashing a badge is going to scare me?" he stammered. But he was already stepping back, his fake strength slipping away with every second. The board members were no longer laughing. One of them lowered his head. The other shifted his feet, avoiding eye contact. The weight in the room had shifted completely, and the president could feel it pressing down on him. William didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His son was standing in front of him, steady, unshaken. The bully's voice, once loud and sharp, now sounded small. This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice cracking. "We were just joking around. No harm done, right?" William's son tilted his head, not blinking, not smiling. "I asked you a question," he said again, slower this time, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Who put their hands on my father?" The president's jaw clenched. He didn't have a way out of this, and he knew it. His fake power didn't mean anything now. It had melted away in the face of real authority, the kind that didn't need to shout. The diner that once belonged to his loud voice was now quiet, controlled entirely by the man in the suit. Every person could feel it. The moment the son walked in, the game was over, even if the president didn't want to admit it yet. And as the silence stretched on, it became clear to everyone in the room, the bully wasn't in charge anymore. He never was. He just didn't know it until now. The president's fake grin was gone now, wiped clean off his face like it had never been there. For the first time since walking into that diner, he didn't look like a man in control. He looked cornered. The Homeland Security badge still glinted faintly under the diner's warm lights, but it wasn't the badge alone that froze the air. It was the silence around it. The kind of silence that carried weight. The kind that made even the loudest men feel small. William's son stood in front of him like a wall, calm, steady, with the kind of cold presence that didn't need shouting to be heard. Everyone in the diner could feel it. Something had shifted, and it wasn't shifting back. The president cleared his throat, forcing out a shaky laugh that didn't match the fear in his eyes. All right, he muttered. "Let's not make a big deal out of this. It was just a misunderstanding." His voice tried to sound confident, but the cracks were showing. His hands, once shoved proudly in his pockets, now fidgeted at his sides. His eyes darted around the room, looking for backup. But none of his board members were laughing now. One of them was staring down at his plate, pale and silent. The other looked like he wanted to melt into his chair. William's son didn't move an inch. "A misunderstanding," he said quietly, his voice so calm that it was almost worse than shouting. "You hit my father in front of a room full of people. You think that's a misunderstanding?" The president's mouth opened, then closed again. He didn't have a real answer. He never thought this night would go any further than his usual bullying. He had no idea who he had just laid his hand on. He turned desperately to the waitress. "Maria," he said, his voice almost pleading, "you saw it. It wasn't that serious. Right?" But Maria wasn't going to lie for him. Not tonight. Her hands were still shaking from when she saw the slap. Her jaw tightened. She took a small breath and said clearly, "I saw everything." The young couple at the back nodded silently. The old man at the counter leaned forward, glaring at the president like he was dirt under his shoe. One by one, the silence in the room turned into quiet judgment. The power the president had built with arrogance and loudness was gone, stripped away in seconds. William stood at the table, watching it all unfold. His hands were at his sides, his posture straight, his eyes calm. He didn't need to speak. His son was doing what needed to be done. The bully had taken his shot and thought no one would ever stand against him. But the look on his face now, the fear bleeding through the cracks, was enough to tell everyone how wrong he was. The The son took a single step forward. The president flinched. Just a step, no shouting, no threats. But the message was clear. You don't put your hands on a veteran, the son said slowly. You don't touch my father. Not here. Not anywhere. The president raised both hands slightly, like someone trying to calm down a storm. Hey, he stammered. You can't talk to me like that. Who you are doesn't matter to me. The son cut in smoothly, his voice cold as ice. Who my father is should have. The board members sank further into their chairs. The bully's confidence cracked a little more. Maria grabbed the phone behind the counter, her finger hovering over the dial. She didn't say anything, but everyone knew exactly who she was ready to call if this went any further. The son's eyes didn't leave the president for even a second. I've spent years watching men think they can do anything because they think no one will stop them, he said. Tonight, you learn how wrong you are. The president forced another laugh, but it was hollow now. You think you can scare me with a badge, he said weakly. This is just a diner. Nobody cares about some old man. The silence that followed was brutal. The entire diner turned their heads toward him, their eyes sharp with disgust. That sentence, those words, had just dug his grave deeper than any slap ever could. Even his own board members looked at him like they didn't want to be near him anymore. William's son didn't blink. I'm not trying to scare you, he said. I'm reminding you of reality. He lifted the badge slightly, not shoving it in the man's face, just letting it shine where everyone could see. You hit a decorated veteran. In public. In front of witnesses. Do you know what happens to people who do that? The president swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. His mouth opened again, but no words came out. His arrogance had nothing left to stand on. Do you know what happens, the son continued, slower now, when that veteran's son is the man who answers the call to make sure people like you face the consequences? Maria let out a shaky breath. The young couple shifted in their booth. The old man at the counter smiled faintly, as if he was finally seeing justice step through the door. The president tried to step back, but the table was behind him. He had nowhere to go. His voice came out weak and thin. It was just a slap, he muttered. The son tilted his head slightly. That's exactly the problem, he said. To you, it's just a slap. To me, it's a crime. The tension in the room thickened like storm clouds. The bully who had walked in so loudly just moments ago was now cornered in his own silence. He tried glancing at his board members for help, but they looked away, pretending they weren't part of this at all. William didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just stood with quiet dignity, letting the weight of the moment crush the man who had tried to humiliate him. The president's breathing grew uneven. His hand twitched nervously at his side. He tried to look strong, but everyone in that diner could see it. He was already broken. Outside, the sound of another car engine approached slowly. The son didn't even look back. They are here, he said softly, and the president's eyes widened in panic. He had no idea who they were, but judging from the badge, he knew it wasn't going to be anyone friendly to him. The board members exchanged worried looks. Maria lowered the phone, knowing she wouldn't have to make that call anymore. The HOA president, who had spent years barking orders at neighbors, making people fear him, now stood shaking like a leaf in a storm. His voice cracked when he tried to speak again. Let's talk about this. But it was too late for talk. He had crossed the line the moment his hand touched William's face. Now he was standing in front of someone who wasn't going to let that go. Not tonight, not ever. The front door of the diner swung open again, this time faster, and the sound of boots on tile made everyone turn their heads. Two more men in dark suits walked in, their movements smooth, their faces unreadable. They didn't have to flash anything for the room to know who they were. The air shifted the moment they stepped inside. They weren't loud, they didn't need to be. Authority walked with them like a shadow. The HOA president stiffened in place, his hands frozen in midair as if time had caught him. The smug look he once wore was completely gone now, replaced with the pale, stiff face of a man who suddenly realized just how badly he'd miscalculated. The agents walked past the booths, quiet and focused. Even the jazz in the background seemed to fade away, swallowed by the heavy silence. They stopped behind William's son, giving him a small nod. That was all they needed to say. The president's eyes darted between them, panic starting to crawl up his spine. He stepped back instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. The table was behind him, and everyone else was watching. The son's voice came low, almost too calm, and that calmness was more dangerous than shouting. "This is the man," he said, without even pointing. He didn't need to. Every person in that diner already knew who he was talking about. The president tried to laugh, but his voice cracked halfway. Wait a second," he stammered. "This isn't necessary. This is a diner, for crying out loud. This isn't some kind of federal situation." William's son turned toward him slowly, locking eyes with him. "You assaulted a decorated veteran. In public. In front of witnesses," he said. "That makes it more than a situation. That makes it a record." The agent stepped forward now, not aggressively, just close enough to make it clear this wasn't up for debate. One of them spoke, his tone flat and sharp. "Sir, we're going to need you to stay exactly where you are." The president lifted his hands slightly, panic finally breaking through the last of his fake bravado. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said quickly, his words tumbling out. "It was just a slap. It was a misunderstanding. Nobody got hurt. We can all just forget about this, right?" But no one agreed. Not a single person in that diner. Maria was still by the counter, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The young couple had their phones out now, recording everything. The old man at the counter was staring at the president like he was watching justice finally catch up to someone who deserved it. Even the board members had shifted away from him, their chairs scraping softly against the floor as if they didn't want to be connected to him anymore. William hadn't said a word. He stood quietly beside his son, his face calm, his back straight. The man who had been humiliated was the only one in the room who wasn't shaking. The president took another step back, his voice rising with a tremor. "I didn't know who he was," he pleaded. "I didn't know he had connections. Look, let's just end this. I'll apologize. Right now. In front of everyone." The son tilted his head slightly, not blinking. "You didn't need to know who he was," he said softly. "You should have respected him because he's a man. Because he's a human being. Not because of who his son is." The president's mouth opened, but no words came out. It was like all the air had been sucked out of him. His hands shook. His voice had no power anymore. The bully who had strutted into the diner with laughter was now nothing more than a cornered animal. The agent stepped closer. "Sir," he said calmly, "you're under investigation for assault on a federal veteran. You'll be escorted out." The board members gasped softly. The young couple muttered something to each other. Maria let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. The president raised his hands slowly. Wait, no. You can't do this. I run the HOA. I have rights. I have power in this town." The son's expression hardened, just slightly. "Not tonight," he said. The agents moved in smoothly, gripping the president by the arm. He didn't fight. He couldn't. His knees had gone weak, and his face was drained of color. The room watched as he was walked toward the door that he had entered with so much arrogance only an hour earlier. His board members didn't stand up for him. No one spoke. Just before he reached the door, the president turned back to look at William, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean it," he muttered. "I didn't know." William finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "That's the problem," he said slowly. "You never think. You just hurt people because you think no one will stop you. But someone always does." The president dropped his eyes to the floor. The agents opened the door, the bell jingled, and the night air rushed in. The man who had tried to humiliate someone walked out with his hands shaking, his fake power stripped from him like a torn piece of paper. When the door closed, the diner exhaled as one. Maria wiped her eyes quickly, pretending it was just the spilled coffee. The couple lowered their phones. The old man at the counter raised his cup slightly in William's direction like a quiet salute. William's son stood beside him, placing a steady hand on his father's shoulder. "You all right, Dad?" he asked softly. William gave a slow nod. "I've seen worse," he said with a faint smile. "But I've never seen justice walk in so fast." The son didn't smile. He didn't need to. The job was done. The man who thought he could get away with everything had learned what it felt like to face someone who couldn't be intimidated. The jazz music began again, soft and slow, as if the diner itself was finally breathing again. But the look on everyone's faces said it all. They'd remember this night for a long time. Not because of the slap, but because of what came after it. And outside, in the cold night, a man who once ruled a neighborhood with arrogance sat in the back of a black SUV, realizing the power he thought he had was never real. The black SUV's taillights disappeared into the night, leaving behind a diner that no longer felt the same. The air was still thick, but now it carried something different, something heavier than fear. It carried the echo of what had just happened. No one moved right away. People were still processing the moment, replaying it in their heads. Just 15 minutes ago, the HOA president had strutted in like he owned the place. Now, he was in the back of a federal vehicle, powerless, exposed. The tables that once felt small suddenly felt like they'd witnessed something bigger than a simple diner fight. This was a storm that had been coming for a long time. William slowly sat back down in his booth, not because he was weak, but because his legs finally felt the weight of the night. His coffee was cold now, but he didn't care. His hand rested on the table, fingers relaxed, shoulders straight. There was no bitterness on his face, only quiet strength. He had endured worse in his life. This wasn't new. What was new was seeing justice happen so fast, without him having to raise his voice. His son remained standing, scanning the diner with calm, sharp eyes. He wasn't just looking for threats. He was reading the people. And the people were looking back at him with a mix of awe and gratitude. Maria stood behind the counter, clutching a towel she hadn't even noticed she was holding. The young couple whispered softly, but this time their whispers weren't fearful, they were relieved. The old man at the counter nodded slowly, the kind of nod a man gives when he's seen something long overdue finally happen. The board members were still sitting at their table like deflated balloons. They looked smaller without their leader's noise to hide behind. One of them stared down at his hands, pale and trembling. The other kept glancing at the door as if hoping this was a bad dream that would rewind itself. They had always laughed with the president. They had mocked people beside him. But tonight, they'd seen how fast fake power could be ripped apart. The son finally spoke, his voice steady but low. "I hope everyone here remembers what happened tonight," he said. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. Every pair of eyes was already locked on him. You saw a man try to humiliate someone who never raised a hand against him. And you saw what happens when he finds out who he's really dealing with. The board members flinched at his words. Maria's lips pressed together tightly. Nobody wanted to break the silence. The son's gaze shifted to the two board members. "You laughed with him," he said. "You let it happen. You thought no one would stand up. But the only reason people like him stay in power is because people like you let them." The words hit hard, not because they were loud, but because they were true. One of the board members stammered, We didn't know he was your father." The son shook his head slowly. "That's the problem. You shouldn't have needed to know that. Respect isn't earned by power or connections. It's earned by being human." They both lowered their eyes, their shame spilling over their shoulders. They were used to standing behind someone strong. Now, they were alone, and they looked exactly like what they were, cowards who had followed a bully. William's voice broke the silence next. "Calm. Steady. You don't need to explain yourselves," he said, looking at them with a tired but firm gaze. "You already did enough by doing nothing." The two men shifted uneasily in their seats. They didn't have the courage to respond. The weight of their silence was louder than any apology they could have given. Maria finally found her voice. "Mr. William," she said softly, walking over to his booth. "Are you okay?" He gave her a faint, tired smile. "I've been through worse," he said, his voice carrying a kind of quiet strength that made her chest tighten. But I'm glad people saw what really matters tonight. The young man at the back of the diner raised his phone, showing the screen. We recorded everything, he said nervously. All of it. If they try anything, the whole town will see. William's son nodded slightly. Good, he said. People like him rely on silence. On no one stepping up. But silence ends the moment one person stands their ground. Outside, the night was quiet again. The flashing lights were gone, but the air felt different. This wasn't just an incident anymore. It had become a story, one that would spread through the town by morning. People would talk. They'd whisper how the powerful HOA president got dragged out of a diner in front of everyone. They'd whisper about the old veteran who stood tall, and the son who came in like a storm. The board members finally stood up. They didn't say a word to anyone. Their heads were lowered, their shoulders hunched. They walked out quickly, like men trying to escape their own reflection. No one stopped them. No one needed to. Their silence said enough. William's son sat down across from his father, the booth creaking slightly under his weight. For the first time all night, his hard expression softened just a little. You always told me to keep calm, he said quietly. I think I finally understand why. William chuckled softly, the sound warm but tired. Anger gives them what they want, he said. Calm takes everything from them. Maria refilled his cup with fresh coffee, her hands no longer shaking. You're a stronger man than most, she whispered. William didn't respond to that. He just sipped the coffee and stared out the window, where the SUV had disappeared. He'd been through so much in life. War, loss, and now the arrogance of a man who thought he could disrespect anyone without consequences. But tonight reminded him of something important. Some battles you don't have to fight with fists. Sometimes, the truth fights for you. The son leaned back in the booth, watching his father quietly. He didn't need to say anything more. He knew this night would stay with everyone who had witnessed it. Not just because the president was taken away, but because they had seen real power. Not the kind that bullies pretend to have. The kind that stands calm, unshaken, and makes everything around it bend. Outside, the neon sign of the diner flickered gently. Inside, the people who had once stayed silent now looked at William with respect. Not because of his badge. Not because of his past. But because he had stood tall when someone tried to make him small. And somewhere, miles away, a man who had thought he was untouchable sat in the back of a federal vehicle, staring at his shaking hands, finally understanding what real consequences felt like. The storm he had started had swallowed him whole, and the quiet man he tried to humiliate had walked out of it untouched. The sun was already peeking through the clouds the next morning when the story of what happened inside that small diner started to spread through town like wildfire. It wasn't gossip, it was a shockwave. The same people who used to look away whenever the HOA president strutted around were now talking in quiet, excited voices. For years, he had treated the town like it was his personal kingdom, using fear and arrogance to get what he wanted. But last night, inside that quiet diner, everything he built crumbled in front of everyone. And the man who destroyed his fake power didn't even raise his voice. William sat on his porch that morning, wearing the same jacket he wore the night before. The one with the patches that carried stories. His coffee cup was warm in his hands, and the cool air brushed against his face. He had lived through enough storms to know when a new day truly meant something. And this day felt different. The weight that had hung over the neighborhood for years was starting to lift, not because of shouting or chaos, but because the mask had finally been ripped off the man who had ruled it with intimidation. His son stepped out of the house, dressed in a plain t-shirt now, not the suit he wore last night. But even without the badge, he carried the same quiet authority. He didn't need the flashing lights or federal vehicles anymore. The people who had been in the diner last night had seen everything. They'd tell the story better than any headline could. Down the street, neighbors who had spent years avoiding eye contact now waved at William. Some gave quiet nods, others small smiles. A few even walked closer, not too close, just enough to let him know that something had changed between them. Respect wasn't something you could demand. It was something you earned. And last night, they saw who he really was, Not just an old veteran drinking coffee in the corner, but a man who stood tall when a bully tried to break him. The HOA board members were nowhere to be seen. Word had already gotten out that they had called an emergency meeting that morning, but without their president, they were fractured. Scared. Some of them were already talking about resigning. Others were scrambling to distance themselves from him. That fake power they used to ride on had vanished overnight. The sound of tires crunching on gravel made William glance up. A black SUV, the same kind from the night before, rolled slowly down the street. His son didn't tense this time. He knew exactly who it was. The passenger door opened, and one of the federal agents from last night stepped out, walking up to the porch with a calm but purposeful stride. "Morning," the agent said. "Sorry to bother you so early." William nodded. "You're not bothering me," he said evenly. The agent's face softened slightly. "It's official," he said. "The HOA president is in federal custody. The slap wasn't just assault. It's aggravated assault against a veteran. Add in the recorded harassment, the witnesses, and the public nature of it. His not walking out of this easily." William gave a slow nod. He wasn't smiling, not even a little. He wasn't happy that a man was facing consequences. He was just relieved that this time, justice had shown up before the wound had a chance to scar over. The agent looked over his shoulder at the neighborhood. "You made a bigger impact than you realize," he said quietly. "Some of those people were scared of him for years. Now, they're not." William's son stood beside him, arms folded across his chest, silent but sharp. "He built everything on fear," he said. "And fear collapses the moment someone stops playing along." The agent nodded, then handed William a folded piece of paper. "We'll need your statement later, but honestly, the video recordings and witness statements are already enough." Maria had recorded it. The young couple had recorded it. Even the old man at the counter had told half the town what he saw. The HOA president didn't just humiliate himself, he did it in front of the world. The agent left, and for a moment, the neighborhood was quiet again. Birds chirped softly, the wind moved through the trees, and the sun lit up the porch. William leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee. People began to walk by one. The young couple from the diner waved shyly. Maria crossed the street during her break from the diner, holding a warm pastry in a small paper bag. "You didn't eat last night," she said, placing it in his hand. "You deserve better than cold coffee and trouble." William chuckled softly, his eyes warm. "Thank you," he said. But the most surprising thing came from the people who once pretended not to see him. The ones who used to lower their eyes whenever the HOA president walked by. They weren't avoiding him now. They were coming closer, asking how he was doing, offering small, nervous smiles. Respect wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Later that afternoon, the two board members came walking down the street together, but they didn't have their usual swagger. Their shoulders were hunched, and their faces were pale with shame. When they reached the porch, they didn't even try to make excuses. One of them swallowed hard and said, "Mr. William, we should have stopped him. We laughed because we were scared of him, but we were cowards." William didn't answer right away. He studied their faces carefully. He wasn't a man who needed revenge. He had lived too long to waste energy on hate. But he also wasn't going to let them off easy. "You don't get to undo what happened," he said calmly. "But you can make sure it never happens again. Not to me. Not to anyone." The two men nodded quickly, their faces flushed with guilt. They turned and walked away, carrying the weight of their silence with them. By evening, word had already spread beyond the neighborhood. People were talking about how the man who thought he owned the town was now sitting in a cell. They were talking about the veteran who didn't bow. And they were talking about the quiet son who walked in like a storm without raising his voice. That night, William went back to the diner. He sat in the same booth by the window, wearing the same jacket. Maria brought his coffee with a soft smile, and the old man at the counter gave him a quiet nod. The booth was no different. The lights were the same. The jazz was still playing softly in the background. But the feeling in the room had changed. People didn't look at him like just another old man. They looked at him like someone who reminded them what real strength looks like. As he sipped his coffee, his son sat across from him again, watching the street through the window. He thought he was untouchable. The son said quietly. William gave a slow nod. They all do, he replied. Until someone reminds them they are not. Outside, the diner sign glowed softly in the night. The world had moved on, but the lessons stayed behind, echoing in every corner of that little town. Bullies are loud, but real power is quiet. And sometimes, it sits by the window in an old military jacket, drinking black coffee, waiting for the right moment to remind the world that respect isn't optional. It's earned.